Good evening and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for this lecture series in this academic year. I'm Chava Tiro Samuelson. I'm the Regents Professor of History, as well as the Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and the Director of Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. Let me say a few words about the center to people who don't know much about us. The Center for Jewish Studies at ASU is a unique hybrid of an academic program and a research center. We serve as an intellectual resource for all aspects of the Jewish experience through the ages, covering diverse philosophical, theological, and political perspectives that bear on the study of Judaism. Through undergraduate and graduate courses, research conferences, public lectures, and exhibits, Jewish Studies at ASU fosters critical inquiry and scholarly entrepreneurship as we disseminate information about Jewish culture. And the goal is to enhance the quality of Jewish life in metropolitan Phoenix and around the world. So as you all know, we are now into the 9th month of this coronavirus pandemic, and it has upended the life of all of us. In fact, the life of all people all over the world. And like other civic and cultural organizations, the Center for Jewish Studies had to move its public events to online mode. And that's why we are doing these Zoom events. So during the fall of 2020, Jewish Studies offers this lecture series. The title is Jews and Judaism Today, Some Burning Issues. And tonight's lecture is the third in the series. We began with a lecture by Professor Madeline Edelman from ASU. Her title was The Future of Gender in Jewish Organizations. That was on October 14th. And we had the second lecture on October 25th by Professor Cheryl Greenberg from Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, on Jews, race, and civil rights. So as you can tell from these topics, including the topic for tonight, the focus is always on kind of issues of contemporary relevance. In spring 2021, we will hold two research conferences. One on anti-Semitism in comparative perspective, that's going to be on January 25th, and another conference on Judaism and climate change, that's going to be on February 28th. In addition, we're going to have 3 webinars that will explore the meaning and relevance of Jewish studies for Jews and non-Jews today. So the entire program is available on the website of Jewish Studies. And of course, if you're on our mailing list, you have received the printed version of the calendar. Let me now introduce our speaker for this evening. I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Timothy Langille, who is a lecturer in Jewish Studies and Religious Studies at ASU. Dr. Langille uniquely combines expertise in 2 rather disparate areas. The first area is biblical studies and the ancient Near East. And the second area is Holocaust and genocide studies. And if you ask yourself, how does he combine those 2 very disparate and far apart in time, those 2 areas, the answer is that he focuses on responses of Jews to trauma, and he explores how trauma has shaped Jewish memory and Jewish collective identity. Dr. Langille holds a PhD in Religious Studies and Jewish Studies from the University of Toronto, that's from 2014, and he has an MA and a BA in Religious Studies from the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. After teaching in Middle Tennessee State University and at the University of Pittsburgh, he joined us in 2016. And he is responsible for offering kind of a lot of basic courses at ASU in Jewish Studies, as well as specialized courses in Hebrew Bible, Biblical Hebrew, as well as courses on Jewish history and memory, or responses to cultural trauma, or comparative genocide. So he's really the backbone of the teaching teaching offering of Jewish studies at ASU. And he's a much beloved teacher because he has a lot of people who do very creative work for him, and one of which we used in the cover of the last annual report of Jewish Studies. So the focus of his work, as I explained, has to do with trauma and construction of identity in response to trauma. The topic for this evening lecture you can see on the screen in front of you: celebrating Purim in DP camps, how Holocaust survivors performed their trauma. And it's very appropriate that we have this meeting today on November 10th, 2020, because we commemorate Kristallnacht, which was, of course, November 10th, 1938. So this date is etched in Jewish memory, and you cannot really be Jewish and think about the Holocaust without knowing the term Kristallnacht. So what we are going to focus on today in today's lecture would be, how did the survivors of the Holocaust in displaced person camps manage to make sense of this trauma? How did they express their anger, their frustration, their sense of helplessness and powerlessness? How did they find meaning in life after surviving a horrendous and horrific atrocity that was perpetrated against them? So I'm going to now turn off my video camera and mute myself so we can all listen to Professor Langille. If you have comments or questions, please submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. After he's done with the presentation, I will start our conversation by posing a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So let's all tune in to the lecture by Professor Timothy Langille.
Thank you, Hava, for the very generous introduction. And I need to use your snapshot for my work because you describe it much better than I do. So I do appreciate that. Yes, this image here is what got me thinking about this project. I was at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in June 2016 at the Silberman Seminar. It was a seminar on using primary sources for Jewish responses to catastrophe, persecution, the Holocaust. And I saw this image, and as someone who does memory and trauma, because that's, as Hava said, that's where Dr. Samuelson said, that's where I've come out of with biblical studies, and my dissertation was on memory and trauma in the Second Temple period, and I worked my way into Holocaust studies, genocide studies, and this got me thinking. I saw this, and I saw 1946. Wow, this is unusual, and this Hitler's uncanny. Like what's going on in this photo here? And the Rolodex of my theory on trauma and memory started going. I started thinking about performance. I started thinking about some problematic theories around trauma and memory with a latency period, right? Some people have posited that there's a latency period, that traumatized people and groups of people have this latency period where they can't express anything in narrative or performance, and trauma comes later and it hits you hard out of nowhere. And I'm going to talk about that, the problem with the myth. It's a myth of silence. We've got plenty of sources that go against that. And in addition to that, I'm looking at, 1946, right? That people are, this Hitler's uncanny. They're arresting him, the child here. And I really started going through the Rolodex of my, trauma and memory theories, and, really wanted to ask some questions about this. So as you can see, this is going to bring together, my areas, given we're going to be talking about Purim, Book of Esther, but also DP camps. And so as Dr. Samuelson generously introduced my work, this is the kind of projects I'm working on now. And this is the first time I'm reading a paper on Zoom. I teach plenty on Zoom. I have a PowerPoint. I just talk sort of freestyle with the students and look at the camera the whole time. This is going to be the first time I'm going to be looking down and actually reading something. So bear with me. After the Holocaust, Jews in displaced persons, DP camps, sought to find a way in which to reestablish and maintain Jewish cultures and identities, including through religious observances. This was a time and place of rebirth and rebuilding. Both Hanukkah and Purim held particularly symbolic value in DP life. I'm going to get into that theoretically a little bit later in this paper. So my presentation today is going to look at the Purim play, or the purimshpil, in DP camps and the ways in which they represent this represents the interface of memory, trauma, performance, and satire. There's going to be a lot of satire. We're going to read a satirical text from 1947 together. The purimshpil became a venue for Jews to satirize their oppressors, perpetrators from ancient to modern times. In this context, Haman, and his modern incarnations, and imagine probably many in the audience do know, but if you don't, he's the arch villain in the book of Esther, but also a timeless enemy of the Jews who manifests throughout history, became a timeless enemy who manifests throughout Jewish history. Moreover, these Purim plays were revenge fantasies against Hitler and other Nazi perpetrators, as you can see him being captured here. We have, in addition to this photograph that we're looking at, images of Hitler hanging from the gallows, Hitler and Goebbels begging in the streets, Hitler burning in effigy. Mein Kampf was actually burnt in Landsberg, where actually Hitler actually wrote it, so very subversive there. So this one photo is what really got this project going, and which, again, this is Hitler as he's captured by the DP police, and he's flanked by this child in the striped concentration camp uniform. So these performances and images raise questions about memory, trauma, responses to trauma and genocide, and satire, and how they're shaped and schematized by the ancient past, right? Because Haman is going to be a big part of the story. So in addition to these issues, my talk this evening is going to, we're going to analyze Samson Först satire, der grager. That's, for those who don't know, that's the noisemaker during Purim that is, rattled every time Haman's name is mentioned. This was written in an unknown DP camp, published in Bucharest in 1947. So in doing so, I'm going to do a few things tonight. I'm going to talk about life in the DP camps. I'm really going to be working off of Margaret Meyer Feinstein's work, and I'm going to talk a little bit about theories of trauma and memory. As I said, the myth of silence, and then we're going to look at this satire at the end. So just a quick background for life in the DP camps. From 1945 to 52, nearly 300,000 Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, these DPs lived in camps and urban centers in Germany, Austria, and Italy. These facilities were administered by the Allied authorities and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. For these DPs, liberation wasn't marked by the end of the death camps, as we see the liberation of death camps and Hollywood films that this is the end. No, this is not the end of the story and the suffering of these people. So yes, this is very far from the Hollywood representations of the Holocaust, ending with this liberation and the Allies defeating the Third Reich. The road to liberation went through DP camps in which surviving Jews were housed with former perpetrators and persecutors. The realities of the DP camps were far from this Hollywood narrative and continued, and this was a story of continued loss and post-war persecution. However, through determination, resiliency, and future aspirations, these DPs persevered. So as Allied troops moved across Europe in a series of offensives against Nazi Germany, they encountered and liberated the camps. Many of the prisoners had survived death marches into Germany after liberation. Most survivors fearing further reprisals from their neighbors, particularly in places like Poland. were unable and unwilling to return, as I said, like Eastern Europe, because of anti-Semitism, the destruction of their communities. Those who did return often feared for their lives. Many displaced Holocaust survivors migrated westward towards the Allies, where they were housed in these DP camps and refugee centers, waiting to leave Europe. And we'll talk about that. Palestine was on the Palestine was a place that we want to go. I'm going to talk a little bit about Zionism. The US was not open to taking in these people as well. Talk a little bit more about that. Most chose to return to their lives in the countries of origins, with Hungarian Jews returning home in the largest numbers. But again, Jews often met, their homes and businesses occupied, and in some cases, violence and death. People, from those who profited off their displacement and destruction. And this is something I always talk about with perpetrator psychology with my students in my genocide class, because they always want to know why ordinary people kill. And one of the motivations is greed, careerism, benefiting financially off things, getting someone's business, taking out someone's business, getting someone's home. That's a conversation I often have with my students with why ordinary people kill. Profiteering is, in my view, a big part of that. So by the summer of 1945, survivors seeking a new life in Palestine or the United States began entering Germany. The vast majority of these survivors entered the American zone. This is from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, great place for maps, as well as information on many other things regarding the Shoah. The vast majority of these survivors entered the American zone, as I said, with a sizable but smaller number ending up in the British zone, especially the Belsen DP camp. Once in Germany, these survivors joined around 20,000 German Jews and 68,000 other Jews in DP camps. By 46, 47, 200,000 infiltrees, mainly Polish Jews, had survived exile in the Soviet Union. They joined. They undertook a perilous and illegal journey to make it here, and they began to rebuild their lives in these camps. And the perilous and illegal journey. Again, side note, I'm full of these when I talk. This is something we have to think about. You see those memes, even things that were illegal or legal and socially acceptable, right? Enslavement here, legal, right? Jim Crow, Nuremberg laws, these kind of things. And, I wish we'd remember this, especially when we're talking about displaced persons. We're living in a time of refugees. We got more refugees now than after World War II. And, some of those claims at the border that they're doing illegal things, they're not. But however, when people's lives are at stake, legality's not that important to them. The DPs transformed the camps into active cultural and social centers, and this is what I'm going to focus on. Despite the often bleak conditions, many of these were former concentration camps, German army camps. The social and occupational organizations flourished here, including theater and musical troupes that toured camps. They had athletic clubs here, and various DP centers rivaled each other. The demographics were, ripe for like a proliferation of reproduction, because many of those who survived were late adolescents, young adults, right? Because most people over 40 didn't survive the harsh conditions of the camps, and most people under 16 did not survive the selection upon arriving at the death camps. However, I should note that most of the people who were performers were actually above the average age of these camps. So the people I'm going to be talking about, even though we have a younger demographic, the older people are actually the people who perform more. In the process, DPs developed a post-war Jewish organization to redefine Jewish identity by having children, again, with the young folks, religious rituals. The Jewish calendar really drove life there, holidays and performances. And as I said, most DP actors who were older, they had some experience before the war. Some had secretly performed in ghettos and camps. So according to Feinstein, quote, DP theatrical performances transformed the Holocaust narrative into one of Jewish resistance and created new endings through imagined family reunions and a Jewish future in Palestine, rejecting the notions of Jewish passivity. DPs emphasized the strong, revenge-seeking new Zionist man and his female equivalent, the partisan girl, the new Zionist mother. Despite their nightmare, fears, and uncertain future, Jewish DPs sought to reimagine themselves not as victims of Nazism, but survivors of the Great Catastrophe. As DPs in occupied Germany, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust demanded respect and demonstrated their determination to reclaim control of their lives. End of quote. And again, you might notice I like my side notes. The key word here for me is resistance. We often focus on armed resistance as resistance, the stuff that often happened in 43 and later when people lost hope, uprisings in death camps, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. But I think performance, writing, these are forms of resistance too. The Oneg Shabbat and the Warsaw Ghetto, right, with those historians, when people are trying to wipe you off the face of the earth, but you document, you write. So I think writing and performance and, trying to maintain and document the best you can, I see those as forms of resistance. And I really like pushing beyond that concept of armed resistance. So these representations and reimaginings were shaped by the Zionist conception of the muscle Jew, which I'm going to talk about briefly, which emerged from the 19th century Zionist thought. The term muscle Jew, of course, was coined by Max Nordau, a Hungarian Zionist leader at the 1898 Second Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. So this muscle Jew was a physical, strong, and was formulated in response to the anti-Semitic stereotypes of cowardly, weak, and passive Jews. So the people in the camps were kind of embracing this concept. The muscle Jew became an aspirational figure for the future, physical labor, self-defense, and it really, again, went contrary to the stereotypes of diaspora Jews and, again, these anti-Semitic stereotypes. For Nordau, only a united, muscular Jewish nation could push back against the growing shadow of anti-Semitism. So Nordau's muscle Jew drew on Jewish antiquity for its inspiration. This is another project I've worked on recently. The muscle Jew, I'm looking at Jews in World War I, Jewish fighting units, more specifically the Jewish Legion, exclusive Jewish fighting unit who fought on behalf of Britain in World War I. They really draw off of the Maccabean narrative, the Maccabean heroism. So it's actually not surprising to me that Purim, and I'll get to the reasons why Purim's so central for these DPs, but why Hanukkah was also, one of the major celebrations in these camps. And I would posit it probably has a lot to do with the notion of the Jew and the new Zionist male and female. So again, these DPs channeling the muscle Jew reimagine themselves not as victims, but as survivors and resistors, as I said, to the catastrophe. DP troops tried to reclaim Jewish identities and reimagine Jewish futures by depicting their recent suffering and persecution through song, dance, drama, including the theme of suffering mother and children, heroic resistance, martyred dead, resistance, revenge, and Zionist politics. These retellings, reimaginations, and performances proved to be cathartic in dealing with their recent trauma by claiming identity and agency. And it's worth noting too, with these performances and with, Purim, where you get dressed up, it's a very subversive celebration. Paul Connerton in his The Spirit of Mourning, History, Memory, and the Body, he notes that masks play a central role in rites of passage, moving from one identity to the other. And I think we're seeing that, I kind of see these as a liminal space almost, from the death camps to here to, the new life, especially in Palestine. And also the Arabic root, which the Latin gets its term mask from, means to laugh, scoff, jeer, sneer, ridicule, mock, deride, and make fun. And I also think of Jeffrey Rubenstein's 1992 piece, Purim, liminality, and communitas. And, he talks about how, Purim's this liminal space where, new identities emerge and, the subversiveness with it, which I think we're going to see in this talk. So from 45 to 57, these survivors who refused to repatriate began to rebuild their lives in DP camps, and while waiting for a future elsewhere, outside the, quote, blood-soaked soil of Germany. That's quoting Feinstein again. Of course, elsewhere often meant Zionist aspirations with both, which offered both explanations of the past and hope for the future. However, options were limited because the British had restricted immigration to Jews to the British Mandate of Palestine. The US had implemented quotas that were not favorable to Jews. And countries throughout the British Commonwealth, they had immigration policies that were very exclusive as well to these Jewish survivors. So this situation doesn't change till 48 with the establishment of the State of Israel. Also in 48, the US relaxes its immigration policies with the US Displaced Persons Act, allowing 200,000 displaced persons, Jews, to enter the country. So between 48 and 50, we see a flow out of Germany. The last camp closes in DP camp closes in 57. People with illness, frail people, marginalized people weren't part of this exodus out of Germany. So the three places and settings that were the central focus for these theatrical performances were past childhood, the Shoah itself, and the futures in Palestine. Those focused on the Shoah those that focused on the Shoah emphasized resistance, revenge, which allowed DPs, I think, to confront and interpret their traumatic past. Thus, trauma was, I don't even know, I'd be interested in this with the Q&A, especially if there are people who are better with psychoanalysis with me, if this is acting out or working through. I've been pondering that this evening. Shoah experiences were rewritten and reconfigured. These survivors integrated their Shoah experiences into personal narratives. Those outside these communities, including allied relief workers, didn't want to hear their stories, but tried to shift their focus from, just like, don't dwell on the past, just focus on the future. Feinstein makes this point, and I'm going to make it in the conclusion. Again, with the myth of silence, it's not that people weren't telling their stories, it's people weren't listening. Primo Levi said that, I believe in the 50s. He was like, I wrote my first thing, but people didn't want to hear it. Europe was built. Who wants to hear these traumatic stories? So thus, representations and performances of reimagining the traumatic past function like group therapy, according to Feinstein. So quickly turning to some theories on trauma and memory, because I need to speed this up a little bit. I'm working off of a theoretical framework with new collective identities emerging out of ruptures and crises through memories and representations of these. This can be, there's continuity and discontinuity with these. Older traditions are repurposed for new for new purposes. Dominic LaCapra calls these ruptures and watershed events founding traumas because they become the basis for collective identity. He argues that these kind of events are typical of myths of origins for people, new identities. Omar Bartov calls this new and unforeseen identities forged in the crucible of destruction. So LaCapra, these are, again, watershed events that represent significant identity changes. And so it's with this framework I'm looking at what's going on in these camps and the way these Purim performances of text are consistent with processes of identity formation in which trauma is construed as founding, generative, and an integrative identity marker in the sense that it brings together several other identity markers. I'm just going to jump over this part here because I want to make sure we have time to look at this text together and have some Q&A. I got a little bit on Kai Erikson here about, how the social dimension of trauma and how, communities are more than just a bunch of, traumatized individuals, but it forms a group culture. And, you know, to quote Jeffrey Alexander, cultural trauma occurs when members of a collectivity feel like they've been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness, marking their memories and forever, and changing their future identities in fundamental and irrevocable ways. Let's see here. Should jump ahead. So yes, so as I want to illustrate in the rest of this talk, you know, trauma can create a community or an imagined community in which members have a status that marks them as part of this community. In this way, trauma can be a communal thing, a common language, common background. And so, you know, it's communities. I'm going to move on to another theoretical part, like with memory as well, that, you know, memory is flexible, it's multi-directional. You know, there's pre-existing schemas, things flow back and forth, right? Past and present, cross cultures. And, you know, these forge new identities and conceptions of ourselves and others. I talk a little bit about Gabrielle Spiegel. She looks at cyclical reenactments of paradigmatic events in Jewish ritual, right? And how, you know, basically, you know, quoting Jan Assmann, the oldest and most fundamental medium for bonding memory is rituals, right? And because I want to turn to Yael Zerubbabel, because I think she's got a lot to contribute to this conversation. She's shown liturgical time, calendar, commemoration is shaped by myth plot structures, you know, representing events that are, you know, adaptive, especially the holiday cycles, where these, you know, these are very malleable as well. Zerubbabel outlines the ways in which conflict formula and holiday commemoration functions as a structuring schema. Enemies and figures are malleable and fluid, absolutely with Haman, changing according to time and place, but the schema persists. She also notes that festivals such as Passover, Purim, and Hanukkah mark conflicts ending in victory and liberation. So again, to me, it's really not surprising to see Purim and Hanukkah here as being, you know, central celebrations and festivals in these camps. A notable example of liturgical time and commemoration are second Purims. We've had these throughout Jewish history, in which Haman becomes the archetypal Jew hater, again, who manifests himself in different ways throughout history. Gershom Greenberg's looked at this, how Jewish mystical thought during the Holocaust, like that they periodized time in this way, in which the Amalek, Haman, in the form of Hitler, right? So this, I think there's a lot of theory that speaks to that. So I'm gonna move on to the myth of silence, because I need to be silent soon, so we have time for questions. So before turning to forced satire, I briefly want to address the myth of silence, which emerges in, again, that scholarship from the latency of trauma, and that basically people were too traumatized to talk about anything until the Eichmann trial. And this is a watershed, right, where people were watching it on television, especially in Israel and the United States. And then people start talking. No, people were always talking about this. People just weren't listening. For me, I agree with David Cicierani's work in his edited volume, After the Myth of Silence, challenging the myth of silence, that takes on, quote, the claims that 1945 to 1970 were a desert as far as testimonies, memoirs, historiography, films, and other representations. Jonathan Clowens, whose work I love, because actually, I think I model myself a bit after him. He likes bringing together that ancient and modern. Quote, a bewildering array of sophisticated responses to the Holocaust were composed in poetry and prose, both during and immediately after the war. He says the same thing after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 CE. Omar Bartov, Browning, Saul Friedlander, they're all examples of scholarship drawing on diaries, testimonies, and contemporaneous Jewish sources. The Oneg Shabbat, Emmanuel Ringelblum and his Oneg Shabbat, right? They were literally documenting as it happened. There are historians being like, if they're going to kill us, they're not going to get away with it because we're going to document it. Laura Yokish's work, Collect, Record, Jewish Holocaust Documentation in the Early Post-War Europe. She discusses this. Alexandra Garbarini is looking at both Jewish and Armenian responses to genocide with this lens. The Kishinev pogrom in 1903, same thing. Zionists deployed Dubnow, Ahad Ha'am, and Bialik to document and not let that pogrom, go unnoticed. So the purimshpil discussed in this talk are, I think examples of the responses to defy this myth of silence. So here's the final section of the paper. As Feinstein notes, quote, the Jewish calendar organized the rhythm of DP life and fostered ethnic as well as religious identity, end of quote. Purim festivals or festivities in DP camps were full of satires, jokes, alternative representations of the world and past events. So Feinstein's work looks at the ways in which celebrations of Hanukkah and Purim were central to DP life, in which, quote, they had clear parallels to liberation from Nazi bondage to the national struggle of Zionists. The entire DP community perceived contemporary relevance of these holidays, end of quote. And this is really where my works focus. So furthermore, Purim plays held a special resonance they provide an opportunity for Jewish communities to satirize oppressors in various contexts from ancient to modern times. These plays took the form of revenge fantasies, as I said, against Hitler himself. Again, that image from the beginning of the talk. Newspaper photographs from 1946 showed children celebrating Purim. Another documented instance had a man in a concentration camp uniform reading from the book of Esther itself and Hitler being hung in an effigy. And as I mentioned, in Landsberg, DPs burned a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf in the very city in which it was written. So DPs celebrated liberation in Purim with costume survivors depicting victory over the Nazis by parading around as Hitlers and Nazis. And this is what blew my mind and what got me to this project. In other words, in the words of Feinstein, quote, the ancient triumph over Haman easily transferred into present circumstances, end of quote. So what I want to do is I want to look briefly at this text. I think, Lisa, am I over time or do I got a few minutes? All right, I'll keep going.
You're good, keep going.
All right, down to the last page or so. I'm terrible with time, as most people who know me know. This satire, Der Grager, is another excellent example of Purim satire from DP camps. Although the author doesn't identify which one, the author does use the purimshpil as tradition to respond to the trauma with satire and Black humor. This pamphlet focuses on Romanian Jews interned in Transnistria during the war. Forced pamphlet was written just 3 years after the liberation of this region. As many as 300,000 Jews died in Transnistria, mainly through mass shootings, starvations. Jews were interned there. This was a culturally diverse place, with multiple languages. Some considered themselves German, others conducted their affairs in Yiddish and Romanian. So this pamphlet combines Yiddish with Roman script. We're going to be looking at the English translation with Roman script and diacritics and vocabulary. It's published, as I said, in Bucharest, but again, written in an unknown camp. And in this pamphlet, he calls it a full satire on Hitler's carcass. It starts with basically like it's a great Purim sensation, how Haman had an audience with God. It's a playful meeting between this timeless enemy of the Jews and God. And in this scene, he attempts to, the archetypal Jew hater who wanted to annihilate the Jews in Persia in the book of Esther, he refers it to as a drunken idle threat. Like, you know what? I got drunk one Purim. I did not mean that. Mordecai and I, we're all right now. It's time Hitler takes my place. And so he says, like, you need to replace me from this shameful spot, put Hitler there. And he reasons that the book of Esther should be renamed the book of Hitler. Haman Tashan, the cookie, for those who don't know, consumed with Purim. should become Hitler Tishan. And the date of the holiday should coincide with the Soviet takeover of Berlin. So let's take a look at this text. I'm just gonna curate it rather than reading the whole thing for time purposes. I'm happy to share the PowerPoint with people. For Purim, a brochure full of satire and Hitler's carcass and its great strength, published in Bucharest, 1947. Need to reduce this here. The grager wishes our friends, Mr. Uri Benador, Mr. Christian, a happy Purim. For the Purim holiday brochure, with nothing but satire, for Jews, glad tidings on Hitler's carcass and his great strength. It's the grager from inside the former camp. A great Purim sensation, how Haman had audience with God. And according to the latest radio reports on Rosh Chodesh Shadar, the following Purim sensation is reported, especially for our Purim grager. And here we present every word in the spirit of Haman, the evil to the medium. Maybe I will read the whole thing. Spiritualists, my friends, you are the spirit that speaks to you from the other world. It is I, the renowned Haman the evil, the former prime minister, the historic king, Ahasuerus, Xerxes, who lives together with his beloved Queen Esther, dear uncle, Zadok Mordecai in the Garden of Eden. I can only tell you that all three are healthy, living princely and prospering, thanks to God. May it be said, every Jew, let us say amen. Perhaps you'd like to ask me when I, the renowned, more like the notorious Haman, suddenly turned into a Zadok in a fur coat who wishes Jews well. Have a bit of patience and I'll tell you my hellish life was transformed after so many years broiling and baking in hell, thanks to the Hitlerite, with its fascist Hamans, who are now in hell and occupying all sections until more chambers can be built. And then he goes through a list of anti-Semites and Jew haters from Titus to Antonescu, and whose names the devil may know. But as soon as I rested a little from such a long period of torment and hell, I recovered a bit. I got up several weeks ago and went to my friend Mordecai, and I asked him at the Heavenly House of Justice to grant me an audience because I had a brand new Purim project. Mordecai received me in a very friendly manner and explained to me he was very pleased after such a long time I had forgotten that a nation of Israel exists. After so much hell, I even wanted to present a project to God to expand and beautify their Purim. Didn't take long to convince Mordecai, and he left me for the Garden of Eden Street and introduced me to the king that stands at the gate of the Heavenly House of Justice with his fiery sword. Mordecai displayed his business card. We were immediately led into a corridor full of diamonds. The king there, Gabriel, instructed us to sit on 2 diamond chairs, demanded for us to roll a parchment, and asked us to write down the sort of request we had. After a few minutes, we were led into a large chamber where a council of kings and Zadoks sat. One of the kings said to me in a very friendly tone, "Do not fear, my child, and say what you request." I introduced myself. I am Haman. I suffered so many years in this hellish camp for nothing, only because one Purim I got drunk and had an incident with our friend Mordecai. He stands here before you, heavenly Lord. Let him say it. Did I even touch him with my hand? It's only because I felt insulted as a minister when my friend Mordecai saw me on my way to the royal court and didn't greet me. And this is why I gave the order that all the Jews throughout the country should leave for Eretz Yisrael. And what the consequences were, oh my lords, you certainly read in the book of Esther, how I suffered a bitter defeat. And thanks to my defeat, the Jews got a holiday, our dear beloved. And every year when the Jews read the book of Esther, when my name Haman is mentioned, I hear it from the Jews, partly with the gragers, partly tapping the feet. My head becomes so confused, I don't even know what sort of world it is I'm on. And this is indeed why I ask God to forgive me my sins against the people of Israel. Now, I want to convert to Judaism. This is where it gets good. And to change my name from Haman the Evil to Haman HaTzadik. And the entire book of Esther, starting with the current Purim, should be changed to the book of Hitler. And Haman Tishan, 3 points, Hitler Tishan, with 12 points. And Purim should not be in the middle of Adar, but on the day the Red Army strolled into Berlin, destroyed Hitler, the Haman of the world, together with his SS bandits. And now we all have a happy Purim, your grateful friend, Haman Hazadik. So that is an amazing text, I think. So just quick conclusions. So what I've tried to do here is, using theories of trauma and memory in this talk, look at how, again, quoting Bartov, Jews in these DP camps form, new identities in the crucible of destruction. This is challenging that myth of silence in response to trauma, which I've heard at conferences even in the last few years where people keep talking about this latency of trauma. I don't understand why. In the words of Feinstein, quote, "Far from remaining silent, survivors recounted and retold their experience. The myth of silence developed not out of their unwillingness to speak, but the unwillingness of others to hear." So from these camps, this performance allowed them to, again, I'm thinking, acting out and working through satire performance, the shape collective memories, reimagine the past and, reimagine their future, which ideally for many Zionists was in Palestine. And that is where I will end this because I believe I've spoken too long.
Thank you, Tim. Hava's going to ask a couple of questions, but I just wanted to let people know if they have questions for you, they should put them in the Q&A and I will read them after Hava finishes.
Well, thank you, Dr. Langille. This is so interesting, and this text is absolutely mind-boggling.
It is.
So I guess I'm not going to take too much time in terms of questions, but here's where to start. First of all, I would like to know more, if you do know. I don't know if the identity of this text is, the author is known to us. What kind of a Jewish person was he? Are we talking about a secular Jew, a traditional Jew? This cannot be written by a traditional Jew as far as I can see. So what do you know about this author? And then we'll take it from there.
I've been looking him up. I haven't found a lot. This is what I've found. I'm still researching this figure. I was looking into it for today. I have not found a lot more about, the origins of this text is unknown, which exact camp, and the figure, I don't think we know a lot about. I've been looking in databases. I'll continue to look. I've even just done the Googler and, not a lot comes up with this. So I don't actually have an answer to that. So but I will try to find that out.
So, here's the problem. The author presupposes that every Jew knows the story of Purim, right? Mm-hmm. That there is a certain base knowledge of Judaism that makes sense of all this. But I'm kind of curious about a lot of Jews who perished in the Holocaust were secular Jews who may not know anything. Many could have been very assimilated Jews, and yet they find themselves in concentration camps. So how does this collective identity, which is based on religious ritual, religious narrative, how does it function for non-religious Jews that were among the dead as well as among the survivors?
I think in the camps, it came together. Like this was, these are people in DP camps, this calendar's holding them together. These performances, because, what else are you going to do in these camps? I think this becomes this is entertainment, right? I like watching HBO, but, if I was forced to watch other things because that's what there was, this might be, because Orthodox Jews, religious Jews, and non-religious Jews, they're participating in this camp life. And it was a rich life, right? Not everyone's performing. I don't know exactly what percentage of the camps would have participated in a Purim play. And I don't know, maybe also I'm thinking if, with these revenge fantasies, even if you weren't religious, performing those or watching performances of that might be cathartic. Okay. But you're right, like this does, from Jews who didn't primarily identify as Jews, but told that they were Jews and they ended up in the camps and ended up dying or surviving, you know, the whole Nuremberg law thing. But, you know, because yeah, there was a lot of Jews who were persecuted who were like, I'm a German first, I'm a World War I veteran. I think I might have celebrated Hanukkah once and gone to temple once, right? Because that was a lot of Jews, especially German Jews. And so, but this seems to be a central part of camp life, right? With the calendar really driving this and these performances. And again, not only that, right? Like sports and other events, like passing your time and, you know, as the world doesn't want to take you and you're trapped there kind of in limbo. I called it liminality, but they're not there by choice, right? It's, so when you're stuck in there, I think people might go outside their box or what they know.
So, another question, and then we'll open it up. You suggest that this is a satire. So, how does humor works in a satirical work? I'm not totally sure. Let's take a look at how he signs the text. He signs Haman Tzaddik. Okay, so he's saying, of course, it's supposed to be a satire, but what is he doing when he's signing this? This is the kind of transformation that he's imagining. So how does the satire works here as a way to overcome trauma?
Yeah, I think this is satire and black humor. I think people use dark humor to deal with stuff. You hear that from first responders all the time, right? That, you know, they got terrible jokes that none of the rest of us would never be able to handle. But, you know, when you come across terrible accidents all the time, like this is how you cope. I think, you know, in our current political climate, I probably rely on satire too much because that's what gets me through it. Even things that depress me, upset me, satire is where I go. So I might be imposing and projecting myself on this text a little bit, but, you know, this is very black humor, right? And the status too of Hitler, because, you know, I've seen before, again, Haman being this timeless enemy, that didn't surprise me, but like the depth that this goes to and just how creative this is. And you know, that first image that I showed from Landsberg in 46, and then this text just blew my mind. I didn't know what to do with this text. I'd never seen anything like this. And it's, I guess the revenge would be, you know, let's remove him from this part of hell, and then, you know, they're building chambers for all these other people and replace Hitler with it. And, you know, but yeah, I'm on making this case, like, you know, it's time that I made a drunken mistake. I paid too much for this. This person's far worse. Let's punish him and commemorate him every year and make noise, tap feet. And, you know, it's a very, like I said, I've never seen a text like this before. And I interpret it in that milieu of what's going on in the camps with the Purim plays in general, with the satire, but this is different than the images or burning Mein Kampf, right, in the city where it's actually burnt, or these effigies. This text is different. Those are overt revenge fantasies. This one it's dark.
Yeah. Well, let's open it up. Lisa, do we have questions from the audience?
We have one.
Okay.
And they are also very intrigued by this text and wanted to know where you found it and how it was preserved, and just anything more you can tell people about it. I think, was it part of a collection?
Yeah, U.S. Holocaust Museum. They've got just such, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has just got such outstanding material. I use a lot of it to teach. They've got this new site that it's actually open access now, I think. You needed to have university affiliation at first to get it, and I've signed my class for it. They can search through primary sources. It's called Experiencing History, and you can look at different themes. You can, do the search, and if you look up Purim plays, this is one of the things that comes up. And yeah, it was that first image that I showed you that made me be like, I need to know more about this. What's going on from a memory and trauma standpoint? I need to know about this. And then I found this text through that search. So again, this is through the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Great. Okay, so there's one more question. Can you talk more about the fantasy of the tyrant arch enemy converting to Judaism from Antiochus IV and Nero to Hitler? How do you perceive this? How do you perceive the satisfying, liberating effect of these fantasies? That's from one of your, just so you know, that's from one of your coworkers.
Okay, I would say two names would come to mind. Well, I would say Stan Francois or even Hal Danish would ask me that kind of question, but maybe I'm wrong. But is that referring to Antiochus's conversion in Second Maccabees? Or just this conversion? Because yeah, that's the interesting thing. Like, because we see that in Second Maccabees as well, right? Antiochus IV on his deathbed basically repents and converts to Judaism. And here he's like, okay, I've done my time. I think I've served too much time. So not only are you going to replace me with Hitler, like I'm a tzaddik now, right? And I'm going to convert to Judaism and seemingly celebrate Purim, right? This new Purim, like I got a new one. People aren't going to be making noise and dancing on me, but I'm going to participate in it too, because this person's a Jew now. I don't know if I understood the question properly, if I answered that sufficiently.
I think we don't have more questions. So let me ask you, a couple other questions have come in though.
All right.
What
like
are some
ballots.
of the, what?
I said like late ballots.
Exactly.
I got to make election jokes, right?
So this person wants to know, what are some of the interesting texts or secondary sources that you encountered in your research? And what did you end up leaving on the cutting room floor? Like, what didn't you share with us? That's interesting.
This is just what Feinstein goes into in her work, in her book. I just scratched the surface, right? Like, basically I used like an article, an introduction worth, she goes way into the camps, the different camps, has nice sections on the, partisan girl, Zionist mother, new Zionist man. I don't want to get up but yeah, I got the book behind me. So I just scratched the surface with that work. There's other theory I think I could use on this, and I'm interested in expanding this project. I want to learn more about this and try and find more texts like this. It would take some research. I'm lucky that, again, through that Experiencing History site that Emil Karenji and his colleague put together, that this comes up, because this is what they've been working on, getting these primary sources and bringing them to the classroom, which I really appreciate from them. And this is just getting out the gates. I did a shorter version of this last year in San Diego. So Dr. Samuelson and I have talked about my research priorities, and I have made a list of those. But if there is a side project I would like to pursue, this would be it. So this is really getting out the gate. So I don't actually even really know what I've left. I, of course, had to shorten it a bit, but I think there's a lot more that could go into this, actually.
Okay, the next person wants to know, was Samson Först from Bessarabia? Several of the names of the anti-Semites are from the Russian Empire and Romania.
Yes. again, even though we don't know the camp, this being from, Bucharest, I would assume from that area.
Okay.
Again, this is all we've got. Just says from the camp, published in Bucharest. Yes, and it is interesting, when you look at the names, there's a concentration there, right? If I were to list politicians I don't like in the world, mine would be very North American heavy with a few other people that most people in the world don't like. So yeah, I think that could be used as evidence of location and background of the author, which again I have not found much on.
Lisa, I would like to pose another question.
Yeah, why don't you pose the closing question?
All right, so here is an example. This text is an example how a biblical text or biblical kind of a myth enables people in the 20th century to cope with trauma. You are a biblical scholar and you specialize with traumas in the ancient world. So can you give us some examples? Let's say even the book of Esther. How does the book of Esther function as a response to trauma?
Yeah, that's well, I think there's a revenge fantasy there, right? That you have someone who wants to wipe you out, and they end up hanging in their own gallows, and the revenge is on them. I think and one thing too, like with things, I think about the destruction of the two temples, and I don't know if my old mentors out there, I did invite him, send the thing to him for the talk, Ehud Ben-Zvi. I remember him looking at a project I was looking at on the Second Temple, and he was like, this is helpful, like looking at how Josephus is representing it, right? Happened on the same day. He's another Jeremiah, right? That this had all happened before, that there's a precedent for this, and we overcome this, right? So, these things that are paradigms, right? Destruction on the same day, having, again, like a Josephus-like character, substitute the Chaldeans for the Romans, and, Josephus loves the temple, and, even though there hasn't been a third temple, but that hope, right? That after, when you mirror it on that one narrative, the Exodus, right? Ezra, Nehemiah, the return. I think that's a meta narrative as well. Ezra, Nehemiah on the Exodus story, right? The double leadership. And so I think these paradigms work, and just that we've got these second Hamans throughout that Yerushalmi actually talks about, and actually Zerubbabel talks about as well, that I think when you survive something and you're like, it was like this other time, and we can overcome this, right? That's where my mind goes with like schemas and precedents and kind of meta narrative structures.
Yeah. So the kind of the moral of the story that I guess you would like to leave with us is that writing and telling or retelling is a way to overcome suffering and trauma and powerlessness and hopelessness. So somehow we it's not just who we are as a group, but how we can make sense of very horrific things that happen to us. And we do it through literature, we do it through performance, maybe even through music in some cases, but primarily through writing.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, like I really do think I go, like with resistance, I go beyond ghetto uprisings and death camp uprisings, which didn't happen, I think, till people lost hope. Like in 43, you start getting more of those. But I really think that writing can be a form of resistance, right? That performing, right? That it's not only coping, but it's also an act of resistance as well. I think these mediums and venues can be cathartic and very powerful in those ways.
Yeah. All right. So thank you very much on behalf of all of us. I really would like to express our gratitude to you, to learning about this very incredible, unusual text that leads us all to think through what it means to be Jewish, especially what it means to be Jewish after the Holocaust.